Hello and welcome to another video that covers all the changes to the Common Body of Knowledge that happened back in May of 2021. This video is intended for those of you who've been studying the material since before May and are about to take the exam. If you have one of the new books and you've just started studying, you probably won't benefit from this video too much, since it'll seem like we're jumping all over the place. So with that said, let's jump into some of the new terms you'll need to be aware of. In terms of third-party connectivity, ISC² gives us the following good practices: creating a policy for controlling third-party connectivity relationships, taking inventory of existing third-party relationships, which means we should evaluate the relationship against the third-party policy and then identify any of those relationships that pose a great risk to us. Next, we would apply monitoring and auditing practices, and we'd want to make sure that those practices are included in the contract documentation. You basically want them to know what you're monitoring and how. And lastly, when access is terminated, we need to verify that privileges are removed, and that interconnections are removed, and that the physical property is recovered. For example, physical access tokens or proximity cards, keys, devices, etc. Now we move on to provisioning. Provisioning typically has 4 steps. Identity proofing refers to a process of reviewing and authenticating official government-issued documents like a driver's license or a student ID to make sure that someone is who they claim to be. Next, the request would either be approved or denied. It's important to take note of the roles here. The data owner would be the one approving or rejecting the request. The data owner would also be the one to provide any guidance or clarification on types of access, such as production or testing environments. Next, the account creation, which would be done by the data custodian. And finally, both the user and the data owner would be notified that the account has been created, and that notification is done by the data custodian. Moving on to self-service identity management. Aside from being self-explanatory, this basically allows people to request changes to passwords, passphrases, and PINs, and usually it's through a browser or a ticketing application of some type. Most of you are probably familiar with this on your jobs. User behavior review is where we look at our users and what they're doing with our system resources. You'd want to set up some type of alerting for use cases that include the following examples of situations. The first is inappropriate use. This could mean you have employees using a lot of bandwidth that's actually needed for something else, or that you have data that's siphoned onto a thumb drive for personal use or for personal gain. It should be defined at the policy level and enforced by user behavior review activities. You also want to make sure that anything that's deemed as inappropriate is made known to your employees through proper training and awareness. Next, you'll want to identify, alert, and review logs on accounts that attempt to exceed their system permissions. Next, we want to identify any rogue devices that try to connect to the network or try to masquerade as wireless access points. Rogue devices meaning an access point that's not authorized as an access point. So fake access points, basically. We also want to identify any circumvention of security controls. And next, we want to identify any misuse of applications, such as invalid or incomplete input data. And lastly, we want to identify any abnormal usage patterns, such as logins outside of typical working hours or any other use cases you might think of. So changes in job duties can lead to what's called privilege creep. Privilege creep is when users accumulate system permissions for new tasks or new job duties, and when the old permissions are not removed. The problem with privilege creep should be obvious. You don't want somebody who started out as an accounts payable clerk and then became a manager who can create and then authorize payments, who also maybe worked in accounts receivable as a clerk and then a manager. You don't want this person to have and retain the ability to create and approve invoices. This opens the door for insider threats and also external threats in the situation where an attacker can obtain the user's password. The recommendation here is that each change in employment status, assigned job duties, roles, or any change in responsibilities whatsoever should trigger a permissions review of some type for the users. And another term for this is permission aggregation. So remember, there's a lot of AKA usage in the exam, so just be familiar with the two terms. A security identifier is a built-in user account in Microsoft Windows that needs to be obscured, and yes, Windows is mentioned several times in the new Common Body of Knowledge. So these Built-in user accounts need to be obscured, and activity needs to regularly be monitored and reviewed for possible malicious activity. The common body of knowledge gives the following specific accounts to be aware of. We have administrator, which is a user account for the system administrator. By default, it has full control over the system. The default account is a built-in user-neutral account that can be used to run processes that are either multi-user aware or user agnostic. The guest account is a user account for people who don't have individual accounts. The guest account doesn't require a password. By default, this account is disabled. The domain administrator account is automatically added to a global group whose members are authorized to administer the domain. By default, the chapter admins group is also a member of the administrators group on all computers that have joined a domain, including the domain controllers. Moving along to privilege escalation. Vertical privilege escalation or privilege elevation is when an attacker uses an account they have access to, or when they've gained unauthorized use by some means to run applications or services at higher permission levels. This happens when the application developers have made incorrect assumptions about the use case for privileged functions, or if the application allows command injection or exploits to be used. Phishing attacks that lure victims into entering sign-on credentials are a stepping stone to vertical privilege escalation. Horizontal privilege escalation, also known as lateral movement, is where the attacker uses an account they have access to as a way to discover, fingerprint, or gain access to other resources. For example, a user of applications and data on one server can jump horizontally or sideways to another server to access data or resources residing thereon. Some mitigations mentioned in this chapter can include security, education, training, and awareness, phishing simulations, of course, multi-factor authentication, and then some of the obvious ones here that should just be automatically happening as part of governance: ongoing patch and vulnerabilities management, intrusion detection and prevention. You have operations here such as IDS, IPS, and of course your SIM products. So you're familiar probably with the star property. In the Bell Lapadula, or Bell Lapadula, I don't remember, people pronounce that whichever way they want. The BLP model, there's a new property in the common body of knowledge called the strong star property, which means a subject can only write objects at the same security classification level as the subject, or a lateral write. So there is no write down or write up. There's only basically a write sideways, if you will. Dual custody, also known as dual control, requires two or more people to simultaneously perform separate actions to complete a critical action. And this isn't a new concept, but it's been changed a little from 2018. It's also called, you have the dual custody or dual control. Distributed is also known as decentralized access control or administration. There isn't much change here, just beware of the two interchangeable terms. They could use one or the other in the exam. I believe this is a new factoid that they put in here, is just the fact that decentralized can be quicker, so access privileges can be faster than centralized. Okay, access control as a system. Contrary to what this might look like, this isn't a cloud type. This refers to approaching access control as an entire system of physical access controls, such as locking mechanisms that interface with logical access controls that are both controlled by a server or access control systems that make decisions and keep logs. So the common body of knowledge illustrates this with the model of an employee scanning his badge on a door reader, which sends data to the access control server, which then reads the data and logs the attempt, sending a reply to the locking mechanism controller, which then decides to unlock the door or deny the request. Sorry about the typo there. I don't know what the R was supposed to be for. Moving on to the identity store. The identity store is a directory that contains information about users. It includes application IDs, names, memberships, credentials, and identification attributes. It allows applications to authenticate against it. Active Directory is an example. Certificate authorities are another example. They maintain certificate identity stores. Moving on to access tokens, we have both physical and logical, which are part of multi-factor authentication. Physical tokens are devices that generate one-time codes and are activated through a second action, whether it's the push of a button on a device or through swiping or inserting the token into a reader. A one-time pad generates a new code on both the server and the user's device. Software installed on a mobile device that generates the code would be included in ISC²'s definition of a physical token. The key difference between logical and physical access tokens for the CISSP exam, to put it simply, physical tokens are used for the actual authentication of a user, whereas logical tokens are not. Logical tokens are data packages sent from the access control system to applications and servers after the user has authenticated. The data packages indicate what the user is authorized for in order to establish a session. The tokens typically have an expiration time and date that are based on security needs and policies. Moving on to single sign-on, as the name implies, single sign-on only requires one authentication. It's important to note the also known as terms here because ISC² loves to use them in the exam. We have reduced sign-on and federated identity. Typically there's a single repository of user credentials. There can be multiple credentials for multiple applications or one set of credentials and multiple access tokens. It just depends on the security needs and the requirements. Each attempt by a user to access another server requires a back-end authentication exchange between the single sign-on repository and the resource servers. So here, as the name suggests, just-in-time provides for real-time creation, provisioning, and deletion of human and non-human user identities, including their privilege escalation and de-escalation. It can also focus on the actions of granting access at a specific moment in time for a single transaction or purpose with a specified set of privileges. Just-in-time access typically uses SAML. The common body of knowledge talks about some use cases for just-in-time. We have privileged account management. This is another JIT related term or just-in-time related term to be familiar with. It's static. The PAM is static, meaning it's assigned and left unchecked. Just-in-time privileged access management is privileged access with limitations. Endpoint privilege management is needed to prevent malicious or accidental attempts to run processes with incorrect privileges or to invoke services on other nodes on a network. And remote help desk operations rely on just-in-time access management strategies. You're all familiar with that. When the notification pops up, you're being helped with a problem on your desktop or your laptop. Remote help desk comes in, has temporary permissions to do stuff on your computer. You should all be familiar with IDaaS, or Identity as a Service, from the 2018 Common Body of Knowledge. So they've added the term hybrid, which simply means that the service is partially hosted on premises and partially hosted in the cloud. Risk-based access controls will increase the number of authentication challenges based on risk factors. An example might be making the user log in with 2 factors if they're coming in from the internet, and then force the user to answer additional security questions if they're logging in from an atypical source or an atypical location, or maybe from a known hostile geolocation. Another use would be to increase the challenges for additional information during peak online shopping seasons of the year due to high debit and credit card fraud. OpenID Connect can be used to authenticate users either to a website or a mobile application. Note that OAuth itself doesn't provide authentication. OpenID Connect selects an IDP. The relying party can then request and receive information about users from the identity provider. That's what that IDP is. The boiled down version of how this works is basically it goes like this. Client requests access to a resource. The request goes to an authorization server. The authorization server authenticates the resource owner, validates request, gets authorization from the owner, and then relays a token to the resource server. ID tokens have the following elements. They have data or claims about both the user, and they have something called the subject or sub, and it's known by a locally unique identifier. They have timing, issued at time, or the IAT, and the expiration time, or EXP, of the authentication event. And they have the issuer identifier, or ISS, of the OP. It has the client identifier, the audience, or AUD, registered for the RP, at the issuer. Also, claims can contain information about the user, such as the first name and last name. So on that note, that wraps up our quick lesson on Domain 5 changes. Thank you all for hanging in there, and I wish you the best of luck in your studies. Check out our practice questions on CISSprep.net if you want to access the best preparation tools currently available. Our question bank is fully updated, but please note that we're still updating our study guide and haven't had a chance to update our memorization sheet or some of our domain videos yet. So please be patient with us while we continue to make those updates. Thanks for watching and have a great day.